Throughout time, people across the world told each other tales of how they came to be, of heroes and monsters, romance and tragedy, death and rebirth. Mythology helped shape the ancient world, explaining the unexplainable. This is Mythology Unleashed. The island of Crete was ruled by the heavy-handed King Minos, a cold and unrelenting monarch who passed harsh immediate judgment akin to a god of Olympus. He was prideful, quick-witted, though these traits would in time create a monster. It was customary for Minos to annually sacrifice his finest bull to Poseidon, the god of the sea. But one year, his herd produced a calf so perfect that Minos refused to kill it, instead sacrificing a lesser bull in its place. Enraged, Poseidon cast a spell over Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, making her fall madly in love with the bull. Desperate for the bull's affections, Pasiphae turned to the inventor Daedalus, and he constructed her a nigh-perfect cow costume. Pasiphae wore the costume in the bull's pasture, and before too long, she and the bull mated. 9 months later, Pasiphae gave birth to a son with a calf's head. Because the creature was of royal birth, it could not be killed. Instead, Minos had Daedalus create the Labyrinth, a massive underground maze full of twisting caverns and passageways that stretched on seemingly without end. This became the creature's home and prison, and the creature became known as the Minotaur. The Minotaur grew into a massive, terrifying creature with a tall, muscular body and a bull's head adorned with long, sharp horns. Even more unnerving was its taste for human flesh, as it was fed criminals sentenced to death. To Minos, the Minotaur was the perfect weapon of power. Once a person had entered the labyrinth, death would soon follow. The Minotaur would easily overpower its victims, with its great strength and sharp horns, while those who managed to avoid the beast would ultimately starve to death. In the end, the Minotaur always got the bodies, feasting on the flesh and sucking the marrow from the bones. While the Minotaur prowled its maze of shadows, trouble was brewing on the mainland. King Minos' son, Anrriquez, was killed in a drunken quarrel by Athenians. Angered by this, Minos declared war on Athens. In order to spare his people bloodshed, the Athenian king Aegeus begged for compromise. Minos made his demands.
For the death of my son, Athens shall send 7 youths and 7 maidens to be sacrificed to my beast. Fail to do so, and Crete will raze Athens to ruin!
Aegeus' hands were tied. He had no choice but to comply with Minos' wishes. And so starting that very year, and every 9 years to follow, 7 youths and 7 maidens were sent to Crete to be killed and devoured by the Minotaur. A dark day for Athens, yet on that same day of the first sacrifices, Aegeus' heir was born. Months prior, Aegeus had married Aethra, the princess of Troezen, who had also laid with Poseidon. When Aethra discovered she was pregnant, not knowing if the child was Aegeus' or Poseidon's, Aegeus was forced to return to Athens and battle his 3 jealous brothers for the throne. But before leaving, Aegeus removed his sword and sandals and buried them underneath a great stone.
If our child is a boy, do not tell him who his father is until he can lift this stone. When that time comes, send him to Athens, for I shall need his help.
Aethra gave birth to a strong lad named Theseus. Trained in the ways of heroes by Hercules, Theseus vowed to follow in his footsteps and rid Greece of the monsters and injustice that plagued the land. When he was 18 years old, and nearly time for the 3rd sacrifice to be made, he was finally strong enough to move the stone. Aethra then told him of Aegeus, and an excited Theseus set off for Athens. Though Aethra begged him to take a ship, Theseus chose to take the land route to Athens, knowing full well of the many dangers that lay ahead. On his way to Athens, Theseus encountered many perils. First he battled the bandit Periphetes, the clubman, and defeated him by beating him to death with his own club. Next, he faced the trickster Sinis, who tried his victims to bend trees and watched them tear apart as the trees were released. Theseus again defeats the villain by using his own methods. He soon defeated the Crymonian sow and the malefactor Sguerra, feeding the latter to his pet sea monster. His next opponent was Creuchion, who would defeat people in wrestling and kill them afterwards. Theseus gained the upper hand and slew him instead. And lastly, he battled the torturer Procrustes and soundly decapitated him with his own axe. When at last Theseus reached Athens, he presented himself to his father Aegeus. However, Aegeus had married a cruel witch who claimed she would aid him in defeating his jealous brothers. In an attempt to rid herself of Theseus, she sent him to face the Cretan bull to prove himself brave and virtuous. This was the same bull that had sired the Minotaur, and consequently the same bull that Hercules captured as part of his labors. After slaying the Cretan bull and driving off the witch, Aegeus recognized and accepted Theseus as his son, and together they faced down Aegeus's would-be usurpers. However, there would be no celebration, as the time had come for Athens to send its promised sacrifices to Crete to appease the hunger of the Minotaur. When Theseus learned of this, he volunteered to go as one of the sacrifices, then vowed to slay the Minotaur. Aegeus begged his son not to go, but Theseus was determined to free Athens from Crete's control. He promised his father that should he succeed, he would replace the black sail with a white one, so off Theseus went to Knossos with the other sacrifices. Upon arriving, Theseus and the Athenian youths were treated well, partaking in feast and games. All the while, Minos' daughter Ariadne had fallen deeply in love with Theseus. Unable to bear the thought of the fate that would await him, Ariadne promised to help Theseus defeat the Minotaur in return for taking her to Athens and becoming her husband. Upon agreement, she gave Theseus a short sword and a spool of thread from Daedalus. The next morning, Theseus and the other youths were hurried into the labyrinth, and the heavy metal doors closed shut behind them. Theseus drew his sword and tied the end of the thread to the entrance of the labyrinth, unraveling it slowly as he and his party made their way into the dark caverns. As they ventured further and further into the blackness of the labyrinth, the spool grew smaller, and the sounds of the Minotaur grew louder. In time, Theseus and the youths found the center of the labyrinth, where the Minotaur lay fast asleep. With a twitch of its nose, the creature caught the scent of prey and awoke with fury. Theseus called out to his companions,
"Stay together, Athenians. The beast is mine!"
The Athenian youths and maidens stared in awe and amazement as Theseus bravely fought the Minotaur. The earth seemed to shake as the combatants engaged one another. Before long, the Minotaur lay dead, and Theseus stood victorious. Theseus then took up the spool of thread and rewound it, leading him and the others out of the labyrinth. As they walked, Theseus realized the Minotaur was unlike the other perils he had faced. The villains along the road to Athens were evil beings who delighted in the suffering of others. The Minotaur, however, was a victim of fate, born out of one man's greed, one god's wrath, and one woman's lust, then thrust into a lonely prison where its beastly nature overtook whatever humanity it may have had, and subsequently turned into a weapon by a cruel tyrant. In slaying the Minotaur, he not only ended the suffering of Athens, but of the Minotaur itself. Having made their way back to the entrance of the labyrinth, the would-be victims made their way through the doors, unlocked by Ariadne, who stood but a little ways away. With no shortage of caution, Ariadne led the Athenians to the docks, where they commandeered a ship and quietly sailed away to Athens. On their journey, they stopped on the island of Naxos, where Theseus had a dream of Ariadne marrying Dionysus, the god of wine and merriment. Heartbroken, Theseus abandoned Ariadne while she slept. At that moment, Dionysus took pity upon the beautiful maiden and cursed Theseus with a bout of forgetfulness. As a result, Theseus had forgotten to change the ship's sail from black to white as he had promised. Aegeus, upon seeing the black-sailed ship, believed his son to be dead, and in grief, flung himself into the sea. In his memory, that part of the Mediterranean afterwards was called the Aegean Sea. Theseus would succeed his father as king of Athens, and ruled prosperously for many years. He would later go on other adventures, aiding Perithous in a reckless scheme to abduct Persephone from the underworld, battling invading forces of Amazons, joining the Argonauts on their quest for the Golden Fleece, and joining the hunt for the Caledonian boar. But his most famous and celebrated adventurer was his conquest of the Minotaur, and the liberation of his people from the clutches of Crete's tyranny.